Hello and welcome to Aurora of Love. And this time we're going to be talking about change, how change actually happens and through consistency, participation, and the intelligence of the body. So not really, there's a difference between how change actually happens and how we might hope it happens, or how it's marked sometimes, or even how it looks like from the outside. But how change really happens with people inside of their nervous systems, their bodies, and in their lives is something that is sometimes overlooked. So people can sometimes overestimate the power of insight and underestimate the power of rhythm. And they might believe that if something really changes, or if something has changed, that it's going to feel dramatic, incredibly clarifying, or emotionally decisive. However, very often change is actually quiet and subtle, and sometimes even disappointing, or can leave people feeling a little like wondering or even flat. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that is. Isn't a permanent state. It's a perceptual state. So a lot of the change that really does last is change that happens in the body, not in the mind, but in the body. And there are three main qualities of what this change has, the components of this change. So consistency, participation, and the intelligence of the body. We're not talking about them as concepts. We're talking about them as real and active agents that help to transform our lives. So consistency, participation, and the intelligence of the body. So very often people can feel a little bit confused when they're really starting to see change, but it doesn't seem evident. So the change doesn't feel like anything. And this actually happens as people really start to shift in their lives. They start to see more true healing. And one of the reasons for this is that we're taught to recognize change through intensity. So emotional release, insight or clarity, motivation, and or relief, a sense of decision or certainty. And we might learn that because we might be disrupted and then go to a therapeutic session or a personal growth workshop. And then we might maybe become more disruptive, or have a release from that. Or we go to a therapy session, we feel disrupted, and then as a result of talking it out, we feel a release. So we kind of associate that cycle with the process of transformation, and thinking that this is the marker of integration, or this is the marker of true change. And that's not actually it at all. The nervous system needs to reconfigure. And in order to create a stable platform, our whole system, body, and also our behavior needs to reconfigure so we can have insight, revelation, and we can have momentary shift. But the actual thing that creates change is the stability that's built into the foundation. We're going to talk a little bit about more of like how that stability works, because we want to honor the shifts that happen along the way, but we actually want to make sure that those perceived shifts are rooted into real and actual shifts inside of the system. So our nervous system reorganizes when it reorganizes and when it's healthy. This is kind of a neutral, ordinary, unremarkable, or even boring kind of way of feeling things, because things are just okay. Like our system is good. And this is because safety and stability they don't really need to announce themselves, right? Safety and stability it might be considered a baseline, something that we want as a baseline. They reduce the amount of signal in our system. not necessarily amplify it. So it is actually an absence of drama. And so for some people, that can feel like an absence of progress because they're looking for the thing that shows them the next piece. So there's this whole piece, especially people who have had highly traumatic pasts and they're used to a fair amount of disruption. There is a whole process of learning how to become acclimated to a more stable system and to a life with greater stability. There's a growth curve that's associated with that. So the mind might look for a kind of a before and after contrast. Right? I was anxious, now I'm calm. I was stuck, now I'm clear. And that it might look at it that way. But instead, we might want like a repatterning, a restructuring, a rehabituating, right? That would actually create more, like points its way to more stability. And the thing is that the body and the mind are not necessarily in sync with each other, right? So our mind might have a particular narrative that has adjusted in one way at one speed. Sometimes it pretends that it's ahead of the curve. Sometimes it doesn't know that it's like what has actually happened and what has changed. So the mind can be moving at this own rate, and the body might have a different understanding. So the mind might not have a new story yet, for example, and that might feel like a void. But the body might have this kind of foundational different understanding. And then we get disoriented. The mind starts to get involved and disorient us in this place. And additionally to this, one of the things that happens is that people use internal tension as reference points. So when they don't have those points of tension, they're not quite sure what to do. It almost feels like they've lost an aspect of themselves. They might even ask the question, what do I do now? How do I deal with this? I kind of feel flat. I don't necessarily even feel like me. And sometimes those kind of feelings can be a sign that there's something else that's going on. But often in the process of growth, this isn't stagnation. It's actually that our nervous system has started to stopped bracing and worrying. And then we mistake this quietness for an absence. We think that something is missing. So our change, the change that we want to get, if we want to put it this way, we're changing our baseline. What we really want to change is our baseline of functioning. And that isn't so much as just changing our mind. And we're going to talk a little bit about that, like motivational change versus systemic change, because we might get like motivated in various different ways to change. But when is that change actually like sticking? When is that really, when is that really doing what it is that we want it to do? Very often people have been trained and to expect a certain amount of fireworks. And that is something that spiritual and personal growth culture has trained us to do. So there's a certain amount of like process of dysregulation, upheaval, epiphany that is like welcomed in the guise of it being truly transformational. And then this becomes sort of a measure. We get hyped up or we have a major breakthrough. And this is to be looked at as we're making progress in our personal growth. And one of the things that I say to people on a regular basis is look at what is actually changed in your life. Not the cycles that you've gone through or the new insight that you have produced, but what is actually changed in your life as a result of whatever kind of, transformation you believe that you've had. If your life hasn't actually changed in significant ways, then that change isn't really happening on much more than the mental level. And so we want to make sure that that change goes all the way through. And it's one of the things, and then another thing that happens is like, sometimes people like psych themselves out a little bit because they have a radical shift and change in their perception, and then it's like they don't have the tools or the knowledge of like how to bring the rest of their system along for the ride, which is what integration is. That like we have our epiphany, we have our shift, and then we need to actually be able to integrate and move that shift into our life. And that can take some time for us to know how to do that. But that doesn't mean that the understanding has gone away. We have that understanding to work with. It just doesn't become real lived knowledge and transformation until we're able to integrate it. That's why it's so important that we understand how to change things systemically and structurally. So there's a difference between emotional activation and integration is basically what I'm getting at there. And where activation can feel meaningful, it gives our mind a sense of something to point to. But where integration can feel more quiet, like there's nothing really to point to. Might have, might not be much to say about what it is that happens or what kind of shift is going on. And our culture rewards intensity. So we want to see what's big. We want to see what's expressive. We want to see, we want to kind of have the big moments. And in our mind is wanting proof, right? It's looking for this proof, this meaning, this intensity. But integration is usually less remarkable in our mind. It's more of a steadiness, a consistency inside of the body. So as I started to mention before, there's a difference, or I want to make some distinctions between the difference between motivation-based change and systemic change. And the first thing that I want to say is that motivation-based change is not wrong. I'm not saying let's just go for systemic change. They both have a role to play in the process of change. We just want to understand what that role is so we don't confuse one for the other in a way that like throws us off, that makes it difficult for us to really perceive change or to really make change happen. So motivation-based change is going to be more inspirational. It's going to be powered by desire, by urgency, by discipline, by willpower. It might be like, I'm going to make myself do this, or this situation is motivating, or this cathartic process is motivating some kind of change. There is something that is kind of willing it. It can feel energizing. It might feel like it takes a lot of effort or mental drive, that it's dependent on like a mood or meaning. And it's really good for short-term shifts. It's really good for starting something new. It's really good for learning or experimenting. And it's really good for moments that require like a little bit of an extra push. However, it tends to fluctuate, and it also tends to be energy dependent, which means once the energy drops, very often the behavior collapses. So you think about that really transformational event where the energy was really high. Once that energy drops out, what's motivating the actual change? So the behavior collapses because it doesn't have kind of the internal pressure inside the system that's necessary in order for that change to continue. And that's not really a character flaw. Like sometimes people think that's a character flaw. I don't have enough willpower. I don't have whatever I should have in order to make this motivation type change persist. But it's not actually a character flaw. It's how the nervous system works. So the nervous system it's like it got hyped up and it was ready to do that. You got the fight or the flight, and you were able to take action while all of that was moving through your system. But okay, now the thing is gone. So the bear is no longer chasing you. Are you going to continue to run? And the answer is probably not, unless you've started to build in some integration or systemic based change. because that thing that's pushing or driving you is no longer there pushing you or driving you. So the system-based change happens when the conditions around behavior change so that less effort is required, right? So we're shifting our baseline. That's why this is the long-term change. It's going to be powered by rhythm, by structure, by our environment, by repetition, by safety. So long-term change happens because we build consistency and we practice it. And then over time, that becomes the norm. That becomes, this is how my system operates. So it doesn't feel dramatic but it does feel more automatic. It's natural. If you've seen major shifts in your life, if you look back, a lot of your habits and the structure and environment of your life has probably shifted so that there are certain things that you don't do or say or participate in that maybe you did in the past. So all of that structural change happened in order to support you in a way. It often feels much easier because the conditions are in place for that change to happen. So when you're being kind of yanked around by motivation, yours or other people's motivation, it can facilitate certain types of understanding, certain types of growth, certain types of forward momentum. But it's really when these baseline components come in place, these stability components that come in place, that the real change starts to become operational. If that doesn't happen, then it's fits and starts. We don't necessarily realize the full-on change. So this systemic change, right, is much better for long-term stability. It's much better for habit formation. It much more builds our trust in ourselves and how we perceive ourselves. And it's sustainable transformation. So the system then carries the change, and that is the foundation. And once that's in place, it's usually harder to disrupt than it is to continue. And that's one of the most wonderful things about when that happens. And so our motivational based change is like, it's kind of like, can I keep choosing this? And like, and kind of the force in place to put that in place. And the system-based change says, now this is the path of least resistance. This is the slow but steady wins the race. This is the repetition, the productivity, or the repetition, the habit development, the consistency, the practice. This is what ultimately forges the path that makes it fast. Change is wonderful and can happen, and it's going to sustain more when these foundational components are in place, and only if these foundational components in the place. And the better we get at it, the faster that then we're able to change, and the more change that we're able to sustain. So one of the challenges that we have along the way is that people try to solve their problems with motivation, and then they blame themselves for the breaks in consistency, their problems with discipline, when their desire fluctuates. But it really is because that the willpower isn't really what we want to sustain the long-term change from. We actually want to put the pieces in place that allow that to build over time. That is why when it comes to certain types of work, for example, empower thyself initiation, why it winds up being so effective, because it actually starts to change the system. And as the system is able to shift and change, it becomes easier and easier to make those behavioral changes and have them hold consistently. So consistency builds the system, and participation gathers the information that's needed to make the adjustments. And then once we have that, we can consider that embodiment, the locking in of the change. So insight and motivation can initiate change, but it's only really our system that can sustain it. So we have to figure out ways of building it into the system. This is why we can't like flash in the pan. You can't just inspire someone. You can't just motivate someone. A weekend workshop or a dramatic experience isn't really going to do it until the system understands how it is that it can sustain change over time. And so then that is the real game changer. That's the thing that really allows change to happen. So it's this consistency that changes people more than insight, right? So consistency more than insight. So insight is exciting, right? It's going to light up the mind. It's going to give language meaning and a sense of movement, right? And because it lights up the mind, it is particularly alluring to people who are more mental. So people who are more mental are likely to get caught up in new insights and like the love of new insights. And it's fine to enjoy that process. We just want to understand where that works in terms of overall change. So it is very rare that insight alone reorganizes our whole system. It's actually consistency that does. So we know this. Why? We know this because you can understand something deeply and still not live it, right? You can have a breakthrough and return to the same patterns weeks later, minutes later, years later. So that's not a failure on anyone's part. It's basically just like a not looking at how the system operates. It's not fully working with the way that we work. So it's asking something from it's asking something of ourselves that we're not set up to do. Because our nervous system doesn't reorganize through understanding. It's going to reorganize through repetition. And our nervous system and our consistent patterns of behavior are going to be what naturally moves us into action in each moment that we are not managing what is happening. Those are the unconscious tendencies. That's why somebody goes towards the refrigerator, right? It's like an unconscious tendency. They go towards something that has helped them in the past because there is a pattern that's there, where maybe there's a higher adaptation that they could move towards, but they don't have that built in to their system yet. So consistency works because it trains us on that deeper level, and in some ways, it's our nervous system begins to entrain. It learns safety, it learns trust, it learns what to expect, but it also trains us in a number of other pattern and habitual ways that help us hold that ground. So our nervous system is a key piece of it, but we also have other patterns that are at play that we want to structure and emphasize and build in so that they become instinctual, our base nature. So this is why peak experiences don't create stability. That's why they can open doors, right? But they're not actually going to complete the whole process, because stability comes from rhythm. It comes from doing something again and again. Just think about the nature of stability, right? So it comes from doing something again and again and again and again, right? We learn through that kind of repetition the things that we've done again and again in our life. We consider foundational, we consider habits, right? And there's not necessarily drama associated with this. There's not necessarily heroics that are associated with this. There's actually just predictability. And so there's a certain point where it's in us, in our development, where we stop chasing intensity and we stop looking for activation and mistaking it for transformation. And instead we start to look at what it is that we can sustain. What can we build into our foundation? What can we make available to ourselves and then potentially to others that allows them to have a more stable and sustaining and consistent foundation? So how have we built more into the system or better into the system. So there's a way that we can mistrust this like the body can there's a way that the body can mistrust when it experiences intensity without follow-up. Just think about it. It's like if somebody tells you that they love you, they love you, they love you, right? But their behavior is harmful, or there's no behavior that substantiates what they're actually saying to you, right? You would think like, wait a second here, that those two things don't line up. The body is smart like that. So when there's like an intense experience, but there's nothing proven sustainable that comes out of it, that has basically been a use of resource and proof that like that was more disruptive than it was beneficial. And this kind of inconsistency keeps the nervous system really vigilant. There's upheaval and there's nothing new and sustaining that comes from it. It's different if there's upheaval and then new systems and habits wind up getting into place. Then the body can say, I'm dysregulated right now. I'm uncomfortable right now. Okay, but I know that if I go through this, something more is going to happen. When it doesn't, when there's just disruption, then basically it says danger, danger. That's the repeated message, and we can override that in our mind. But that's basically what's happening in terms of our physical body, is that we're just getting more and more messages that what is going on is dangerous. And that is not something like, that we should trust, that we should repeat. The opposite really is when repetition is used and we consciously put in effort to participate, then we start to develop trust in ourselves. We don't just skill of whatever it is that we're doing. We start to develop an actual trust in ourselves. I know that if there's a problem, that it will be resolved and good things will come out of it. Right? So if you had a disrupted childhood, if you had a difficult, uncomfortable childhood, right, you probably learned that disruption, right, was followed by more disruption, and that there wasn't really a reason. And so then you become hypersensitive to disruption, and there's a loss of resiliency that can happen there. Instead of when a child learns that disruption is followed by new skill building or new practice or new levels of consistency that actually yield something better, then what happens is trust in self, trust in other, and development of a skill. So you can now see how early trauma starts to interrupt our ability to trust self, trust other, and develop skills. So we begin, when we start to do this with ourselves, when we start to like recognize this and recognize how we can build consistency into the mix, then we can start to see really, really powerful change happen in our life. So a good thing to kind of keep in mind is that the body isn't going to ask if something was meaningful. Right? It's really going to ask if it's going to happen again, right? So the body doesn't ask if it was meaningful. Our mind says, oh, yes, that was meaningful. I learned this and this and this. But our body says, am I in danger? Am I okay? Is this going to happen again? Or am I safe? Am I at peace? Is this a trustworthy situation? Is it going to happen again? And it builds it based on repetition. Another aspect of this that I want to talk about is the relationship between participation and commitment. First of all, saying that participation is not a commitment. And just give me a moment, I'm going to weave this in, why this is so important to what it is that we're talking about. But one of the challenges, and it creates a bit of tension, really, is that people confuse participation with commitment. And participation is really just the phase of showing up, right? And commitment is about choosing something, choosing the path, choosing the structures of life. So participation is going to gather information, and commitment is going to create the structures that we need. So when we collapse these two, we either rush ourselves into decisions that we're not ready for, or we avoid showing up because it all kind of feels too like locked in, too final. So participation isn't like declarative, it's relational. It says like, let me like kind of try this out. Let me see what this actually feels like. I'm showing up, I'm participating to know what this is like for me. And it allows us to assess like our safety, our resonance, our capacity, our truth, right? We don't necessarily have to have like stakes in the game at this point in time. We can just feel it out. I'm here. Let's see how this goes. Let's explore this together. Right? So we don't pledge allegiance to something. You don't go, I mean, it's like a very uncomfortable thing, right? Like, oh, you don't know anything about this. You have no experience. Now you need to commit to it. And in that commitment, like once you commit, then you get your answers. Well, so there is some information that comes in with commitment, but it's important that we are not really like pledging allegiance too early, right? But that we're learning through proximity, that we're close enough, long enough, that we start to feel what something actually produces. So we get to stay and participate in something, and that's how discernment starts to shape. So we get our body's feedback. We listen, we pay attention. We see how something rolls out over time. And then this is what starts to like ripen us, move us into a place where then we might choose commitment. So participation is going to create the systemic conditions for change to happen. And then the commitment reinforces these conditions through conscious choice. And when it does so, it creates maximum security, and it also allows for a whole new level of things to open up. But we don't start there. And that's one of the things that happens. Like there's actually, when there's issues around, you could say around attachment or around connection, when there isn't enough space given to participation, then there's an emphasis that gets put on commitment either internally or externally. And internally, that's the person doesn't give themselves permission to participate without committing. And so they feel dysregulated or on alert because they don't have the information that they need in order to feel okay with the way that they're choosing to be committed. So one of the things that we can look at is actually allowing space for participation and for this growth of lived experience to happen so that we then feel comfortable with making choices of commitment. But we need, in order to do this with the participation phase, we need to know what it is that we're paying attention to. What are we trying to see during this participation phase? That will help us then know how we might be able to use commitment to be able to support further habit development, further development of the foundation, that kind of thing. So we could say that until we know that something is good for us, we're not able to really commit to it. And so we want to have that information. Once we have that information, we're able to make that commitment. But if we back up a second and just say, okay, why don't I move back into allowing myself to gather the information about how I feel about this. For example, making a change in life. We could make a change in life. Say it's around like eating habits or something. And it's difficult to make the change. And we think, well, I already know that eating this way is healthy for me, therefore I've gathered enough information. Yes, on some level, maybe your mind knows that. But how about we slow down for a second and actually go through the lived experience of developing the awareness that these foods are actually good for your body. Then when you know that, it might be easier for you to transition into commitment, and it usually is, whether that's a commitment to not do something or a commitment to do something. So our participation is an important part of stabilizing and helping to create the foundation, of helping to build enough information, helping us integrate and develop ourselves so that we can really see this change happen. And oftentimes, where our commitment patterns are disrupted, there's a lot of conflictual information that's inside of them. And this then leads to challenges and problems in being able to move forward. So we don't actually want to pressure ourselves with commitment prematurely, because it actually destroys our discernment. It makes it difficult for us to see what it is that is truly good for us. It can also, premature commitment can create resentments or collapse, because we haven't fully gotten to the place of, is this right for me? The trick here is, in the participation phase, we need to fully participate. We can't participate from the place of like distance, in the sense of like, I'm going to wait until this has been proven to me. We have to participate knowing that we aren't yet committed. See what the data is and then make a clear decision. And in some ways you could say, like, to cut your losses if it's not working out, or to jump in if it is working out. But we want to make sure that we gather that information first, so that we don't collapse afterwards. That allows us to move forward in a really, really good way. So this is really the difference. What I just described is the difference between avoidance and appropriate, like, non-commitment. So avoidance would be like, I'm not going to go near this. I'm going to distance myself from it. I'm not going to look at it on whatever level. And appropriate non-commitment says, I'm interested, I would like to participate, but I don't have my data yet. So I need more data before I'm going to be able to step in. The body needs certain types of data. Interpersonally, a lot of times we need to know that it's a healthy relationship, we're going to be treated well, that kind of thing. And once that happens, then we're able to truly step in with commitment. We can mind ourselves into certain types of commitment, but so we can mentally sort of move ourselves in that direction, but that has the staying power of sort of a motivational situation versus a stabilized situation. So we want to use participation to gather data, and then we use our commitment to help organize reality, to structure life, to build the foundation. The final piece for today is about embodiment. So we often talk about embodiment as like expression or presence, right? So, but let's talk about it as intelligence. Like, the body records patterns. It doesn't necessarily record ideas or explanations, but patterns. It knows like whether something is working or not working, right? Before other things let us know. So when we tune into our response to a situation, we can kind of know. Now, can we whip our body up into a frenzy with certain types of thinking? Yes, that is possible to do. And people do that. Many anxiety disorders are the result of people like kind of working their thoughts in such a way that it activates their system. However, Our body can provide us with direct information about how we're perceiving a situation, but we do need to be able to listen to it and not our mind's version of what's going on in the body. And this can take a little bit to unpack, actually. And one of the things that can help us unpack this a little bit is like how we work with our nervous system. So once we start to get to a level of kind of coherence and stability, then we really start to be able to work with our understanding and move through the world in a new way. But we kind of have to go through the steps of retraining ourselves so that we can really develop our capacities for integration. We can develop our capacities for in terms of our change. But again, there are some pieces that we need to unpack inside of that in order to get down into it. The more trauma that you have, the more that you might need a bit more work or understanding with this piece of things to really be able to sense the body cues in a way that is helpful. So our body has signals of safety. And I want to just clarify here overall, there's lots of talk about like safety and safe space and stuff like that. We're not necessarily talking about that. We're not talking about what other people need to do in order for us to feel safe. We're talking about what is actually happening in our physical body so that we can understand how to work with that. And our nervous system is there just basically letting us know, do I feel safe in this moment or not? And when the answer is yes, the body overall relaxes its guard. It's going to slow down its reactions. It's going to allow its attention to widen, and it becomes more capable of learning and change. And so when the answer is no, the body is braced, and it really doesn't matter how good the ideas are. It doesn't matter like how inspirational they are. It's not actually able to there's not receptivity in the system. So that's why that shift needs to take place first, but we're ultimately responsible for that shift. That isn't a responsibility that we put on other people. So when we are feeling safe, our emotions, we're able to move through our emotions without them feeling really overwhelming. Our attention becomes steadier. Our behaviors start to shift with less force, and we don't need to control outcomes in the same way. But that's also why one of the key indicators of real change is not excitement, but is that we actually need less effort because we're not fighting our own system. So that's part of what that acclimation is. We actually start to feel like we need to put less effort into things because we're not fighting ourselves. We're more congruent. We're more aligned. We're more peaceful inside of ourselves. So this is because there's a certain amount of predictability, or the world is not threatening, right? And again, if you have a trauma history, it might take some time to not perceive the world as threatening. But the body does update its expectations, not necessarily like on a conscious level, but on a physiological level, it will shift over time. So it starts to learn, the body starts to learn that it doesn't need to stand guard in the same way. And that's when new patterns become possible. And it's less about a decision, and it's more because our system now allows this change to happen. So it's a really important thing that we start to be able to tune into what is happening inside of us and how to we work to create this spaciousness. We work to create this level of integration. And again, we don't work with that first out in the world. We actually work with that at the places like closest to us. And we start developing that language, that ability to talk with ourselves, that ability to hold ourselves in a regulated space. And then we begin to move that out into the world with greater and greater sustainability. Because if that is based purely on the behavior of others, then we'll always be limited. So when urgency is well-intentioned, even when urgency is well-intentioned, right? It's the system is going to feel it as pressure. And pressure is going to keep the system vigilant. And the urgency tells us something is wrong. I need to fix this now. Right? So we can know that, like that impulse, I got to do something about this. I got to do something about this, right? Is like a sign from our system that we are in a state of urgency. And that safety is what allows us to then reorganize and readjust. So we work with ourselves to, one, start to hear the voice of our system and what yes is inside of that. Start to be able to hear that. And then the other is that we start to work to sustain that state of openness, coherence, balance, whatever you want to call it, centeredness. There's lots of different words that have been used over time. So we work to sustain that. We work to sustain that through our regular practices, through the way that we take care of ourselves on a regular basis. And then as we sustain that more and more, then we start to be able to use that as we move throughout the world to help us determine what it is that's going on. So to engage more fully in participation and eventually to move in places to commitment so that we can build and grow and develop things. And to also have times where we move into participation and we calmly, safely, and in a caring way for ourselves, remove ourselves from that situation if that's not actually something that's going to be supportive. So in that, we're able to make choices about what is and is not supportive for our life and sustaining our overall well-being. So if we're resisting something, you actually can't force through that resistance, but it does need to be addressed. We do need to address it. We need to figure out, what does it take for me to get myself back to a place of like balance, of stability? And for some people, again, with significant trauma histories, they might not know that place. They might need to work, understand what it feels like to be in that place. And so that's some of the work is to teach that. So the person then has a lived relationship reference point inside of themselves of what it feels like to be that way. And then when that starts to build and develop, we can then see what is in support and what is not in support of our welfare, and what will help us to be able to grow and sustain and develop over time. And again, we don't get there through controlling the world around us. We get there through working with ourselves and understanding how each of these components works to be able to integrate and develop and move change into reality. So our understanding is very often the mind like catching up to something that the body has already accepted, or it's our catching up to the rhythms, the energies, the everything that is present in the system. So all of this is to say that if change is feeling quieter than expected, or slower, or subtler, or less dramatic, right? It actually could be a really good sign that you're moving in the right direction. It might mean that there's some really big shifts that are taking place, because this consistency is going to reshape your whole system, and your ability to participate is going to allow you to be able to see more of the truth. And then the ability to integrate that and hold that is what allows this all to sustain over time. And this isn't this isn't a motivation question or issue It's an issue of understanding how we actually create long-standing change and the different levels of our being, and what are the tools that we have to work with in this place. I'm going to pause for a moment here for some questions. And let's see here. I like this question. I kind of already answered it, but I think it's worth highlighting again, which is it normal to feel neutral or blank after periods of deep work? And the answer is yes, it is normal to have those times of integration. In fact, at those times, like, the best thing is to relax, to enjoy and nourish, care for yourself, move forward with any plans, commitments, or things like that that you might have in the works. Just kind of business as usual. Start building, not in a rushed way, but in a way that's like deliberate and caring and of yourself and your life. And that then becomes your baseline. So when we go back into it on a mental level and grabbing for different pieces of information, then what can happen is that we actually mess up the process. We imbalance the process instead of, or disrupt it, instead of allowing that integration to take place. So if we've had a true shift, right, or we believe that something has shifted, the best thing that we can do is build the sustainability of that habit in our life, and really start like seeing that and living that and asking the question, is there something that I could do that would make it easier for this habit to root in my life, rather than I'm worried that I won't be able to will this into being anymore, or I'm concerned about, will this stay or will this not stay? You know, the more that you can build it into your life, the more that it will stay. One last question before I wrap up. It's a really good one. So, how can I tell if I'm processing something or just reactivating it? So, this is a really good question. And so, one of the things that we want to look at is how many times we've engaged with that particular piece of material, would be one thing that would be helpful. What's happening in our system as we're going through it, and what is the result that is coming from that? So processing should feel like peak potentially, and then getting less and less and becoming integrated. Could it be a peak and nothing? But the idea is that you don't have growing intensity over time, and that you've looked at something, you've acknowledged something, you've been with the emotions on something, you've honored and been present to it, and then you are allowing it to go and grow. Key indicator of this is where the process comes from. Is it activated by your mind, or is it activated in some other way? So when, like, looking at grief, for example, as people are processing grief comes in waves. Anybody who is grieving will tell you that they will all of a sudden be blindsided by a wave of grief, and that they don't know when that's going to happen. Is it sometimes connected with like an association or something along those lines? Yes, it can be. Somebody says something, or there's a smell, or there's an article of clothing or something like that, and the person is then activated into it. But the movement of the emotion is just that, the movement of emotion, and then it subsides. Where if you're stewing on something, the mind kind of fixates on it, and it will drag up emotions that are associated with it. And so what that feels like, it actually feels more like a retrieval than flow. And that would be like kind of words. But this is part of what we want to learn about ourselves. We want to start to be able to tell this about ourselves. Like, okay, what am I doing? Am I processing something out, or am I reactivating something? Other things have to do with time frames. So if you're still processing something years and years later, right, chances are you've reactivated it. And because the event itself is no longer present in your life, and chances are you've had an opportunity to deal with the emotions. If you haven't, they'll probably kind of explode out, and then that gets processed through, and then there's not much more that's associated with it. You might feel, you might have some like lingering aftershocks, but for the most part, that's kind of how it feels. Like you realize something, there's a movement of emotion, and then that is complete. Now, sometimes things are tied to other pieces and it gets a little complicated. So again, that's where we learn to listen to ourselves and understand, like feel, sense what it is that is going on. So there's an art to that, just like there's an art to listening to the body and what the activation of the body means. And so we want to start to pay attention. Those are some keys, some very important keys to being able to really make change happen in our lives. So allow the peace to settle. I'll allow the calmness to settle, for the new foundation to find its way, to build through consistency and care and habit. Allow this different type of intelligence to work in your life. Allow this new integration to come in. Acknowledge the fact that perhaps the feelings that you're feeling right now of neutrality or being ordinary or less charged are actually signs that you are maturing, not stuck, and begin to work with those to build a whole new life and a whole new movement forward. So I want to thank you for joining me on Roar of Love today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you for listening to the Roar of Love podcast. If today's episode spoke to you, visit Sacred Lights at sacredlights.com for more insights and guidance on your journey. Until next time, stay open, stay true, and keep answering love's call.